Susan Wingrove-Reed. I'm the principal keyboard player for the Anchorage Symphony Orchestra and the education consultant for the symphony. And it's really fun to have done a bit of research and learned some new things about the program that we'll be playing at the end of February in the Anchorage Symphony concert, including works by Rossini, Billy Childs, and Beethoven. So I'll dive in with some thoughts about Rossini and the Thieving Magpie Overture. Now, Rossini is a bit of a character. He wrote his first opera when he was 18 years old, and it was a huge hit. He was wildly famous by the age of 25. Gondoliers in Italy sang his arias. Everyone knew the tunes. Mobs followed him. He was like a superstar of the rock and roll world we think of today. People thought it was pretty cool if they could get a lock of his hair as a prize or a souvenir. He was a speedy writer. He claimed that he wrote one of his many operas in just 11 days. But truth to be told, he borrowed melodies in one work to use again in another more often than one would guess. Musicologists have had a lot of fun doing some research on that. In the early 1820s, he wanted to be taken a little more seriously than writing just comedies. And The Barber of Seville was considered to be one of the gems of his output, which was a comedy, but also did explore a bit about relationships between people, etc., that got a little interesting, so to say. He himself fell in love with a soprano and got married around that time, and was invited to Vienna, where he had some new audiences for his operas, and he also was able to meet Beethoven. So I found that this was a cool theme about the concert, since we're going to end tonight, the program on Saturday night, with the Beethoven Second Symphony. Rossini was shocked to find the famous composer in ragged clothing in a filthy apartment, and the two of them had a long chat. Beethoven praised Rossini's Barber of Seville, but then shocked Rossini by saying that he should never try any other form, saying specifically, "You do not possess sufficient musical knowledge to deal with real drama." This deeply wounded Rossini, gave him a lot to think about. His next hit was William Tell, but depression was growing a little bit because of that conversation that he kept revisiting in his mind. The modern world started to terrify Rossini. Trains, politics, Wagner bewildered him. In 1855, he married a new wife, Isabella. His first wife had died, and she had been a gambler and an alcoholic. So it was a terrible disaster what happened as her life had progressed. But he was happier now with his second wife, and he wrote a series of very short, clever piano pieces called Sins of My Old Age, and included 4 hors d'oeuvres as one of the movements, which included sections called radishes, anchovies, gherkins, and butter. This was Rossini to a T. He was a gourmet cook, by the way. He loved to eat and became legendarily plump. Well, let's get down to brass tacks with The Thieving Magpie. 1817, he wrote this along with 3 other operas the same year. And the story of this opera is kind of intriguing. There's a housemaid at a prosperous farm, and she resolves to hide her father, who has deserted the army to evade execution for arguing with another officer. The father gives her a spoon that she can sell to raise money needed for his undercover survival. It's a silver spoon. Enter the local mayor, whose romantic designs the servant girl steadfastly resists. A spoon is discovered missing from the farmhouse, and the servant girl is arrested to the mayor's vengeful delight. At her trial, her father emerges to argue on her behalf, but he's recognized at the trial as a fugitive deserter and is also taken into custody. The housemaid is found guilty of stealing the spoon and is sentenced to death. She marches to the scaffold, but at the last minute, a reprieve arrives from the king for both the father, because the king is moved by a spirit of forgiveness, and the maid. And she then marries her beloved, and everything is tied up with a wonderful ribbon. Now, this is based on what appears to have been a true case where a maid was arrested for stealing a spoon and she was actually executed. And that story went all over Europe because this was a time of terrible changes that threatened the rich upper classes, but then eventually led to the elimination of the death penalty for thievery. And so that was a really good result of the unfortunate maid's story. And Rossini took the story and gave it the happier ending that she had deserved all along. The overture begins with a surprising solo snare drum, and then a rather bombastic march follows, very militaristic. And then the hapless servant in prison is contemplating her fate, and the judge is preparing the court, but then the music gets louder and louder, and a fast and furious ending, which is a happy one. I went into a used kind of an antique shop once a few years ago, and I discovered an old set of books on the shelves, including Victor Borge's book, My Favorite Intermissions. And I wondered, what would this be about? And it's about opera intermissions and reflections on the composers of operas. And he has a little paragraph about the Thieving Magpie overture. So I will share Victor Borge's analysis of what happened. If anything gave Rossini more headaches than endings, it was beginnings. Whenever he could, he simply dusted off an old overture and added the title of the new opera. Most impresarios were wise to him, though, and demanded their money's worth. With The Thieving Magpie, Rossini waited until the very day of the premiere. Then he came down to the opera house, smiling and cheerful, saying to the manager, what a nice idea it would be to have an opera without an overture for a change, especially since he hadn't written it yet. Unfortunately, the manager did not think this was a good idea in the least. What's more, he then locked Rossini up in the attic of the opera house with pen, paper, and 4 husky stagehands. The pen and paper were for Rossini to write the Thieving Magpie overture with, and the 4 husky stagehands were there to throw him out the window in case he didn't. So he did. As fast as he could dash off the pages, Rossini flung them through the window. Below, in the courtyard, a small army of copyists scooped up the papers and wrote out the parts for the orchestra, while the impatient impresario danced around tearing his hair. All of my impresarios were bald at 30, Rossini boasted when he finished the job, just barely in time for opening night. We might take this with a grain of salt, but I'd like to believe the whole story is true. Second on our program on February's classic concert is a premiere by Billy Childs, featuring a good friend of our orchestra returning to play with us once more, and we're highly excited about joining up with her, Rachel Barton Pine. And Billy Childs is one of America's great treasures these days. We're really, really proud of our orchestra's commitment to new works, and our Musica Nova group that was formed while Randy Fleischer was our music director has done an amazing job of commissioning new pieces that Randy was always so proud to premiere as part of our regular annual seasons. And Randy was especially passionate about this commission. Rachel had approached him and said, I know that the Anchorage Symphony wouldn't be able to afford this on its own, but I'm looking for a consortium of orchestras that might put resources together so that we could offer a contract to Billy Childs to create a concerto that will be truly unique, fusing jazz as well as classical music together. And Randy loved the idea and was so excited about performing this, but COVID hit and canceled, of course, that premiere. And now sadly, in a bittersweet way, we're excited, but also grieving a bit this week, wishing Randy could be here, but knowing that he would be beyond thrilled to know that we're doing the Billy Childs with Rachel and with Elizabeth on the podium, who was a very good friend of his. So Elizabeth is guiding us through this amazing, dense masterpiece, and we're super, super excited for Saturday night. Now, Billy Childs is a Grammy-winning jazz pianist, 5 Grammy Awards, 16 nominations, and he's also a composer, conductor, and arranger. And he's been compared in some ways to Aaron Copland with his idea of using American music as the root of classical pieces. And he fuses modern jazz, soul, pop, neoclassical music. He's highly trained as a classical player and writer, as well as a jazz artist. He wrote in 2013 a piece that I would love to hear performed live called Enlightened Souls, which was to honor the 50-year anniversary of African American students attending Duke University. And he's also written a piano quintet that I think we should take a look at down the road, and with the subtitle, The Bird, the River, the Storm. Now, the Boulder Philharmonic had the honor a couple of weeks ago of playing the actual world premiere of this piece, but the Anchorage Symphony, out of the 4 orchestras that have come together to commission the work, we get the second performance. And Rachel said, I highly recommend a podcast if you have some time to listen, either before or after the concert, to know more about this process. She and Billy did an interview for the Strad magazine. So you can go to thestrad.com. The podcast lasts about 15 minutes. And Rachel says within this interview, if our violin concertos were only written by violinists, we'd get things that were very idiomatic, but perhaps never transcending that. Now, she says it's like being an instigator when you're doing the new thing, and she's instigating the premieres of this concerto. Childs has written several other works for her, but this is the first one that includes full orchestra along with her violin skills. And Billy said that as COVID hit, working on this concerto kept me sane and gave me purpose. He began with the final movement, which has a subtitle of Resilience, which I think is a wonderful inspirational title for us as musicians exploring the music, but also for our audience hearing it. And he said that in a sense, writing the concerto was like exploring the 5 stages of grief with COVID hitting. Rachel said that collaborating with a live composer is like, it's an emotional interaction with guidance that goes back and forth between the composer and the player beyond the score. And she said that in the opera world, thinking again back to Rossini for a second, when you are the first to do a role in an opera, you're called the creator of that role. And she said that she thinks that word is kind of appropriate when you are the creator, the first to play a concerto like this. Child said that he was influenced by Samuel Barber, and a composer we featured on our last concert, William Walton, Corigliano's Red Violin Concerto, which we've played here at the Anchorage Symphony before, and also jazz artists like Keith Jarrett and Herbie Hancock and many, many others. And a reflection that Rachel added is that the sonorities, the colors for her violin as well as the orchestra are sheer pleasure to explore. So here we are, a start of the journey with the new work, and the second performance in the world will be in Anchorage, Alaska this Saturday night. Excitement. And after the intermission, we get a glorious exploration of Beethoven's Second Symphony. Beethoven transformed classical music into something bigger, bolder, and richer than ever before. And he was only 26 years old, though, when he started losing his hearing. He went on to compose for more than 30 years. And it's as if Michelangelo went blind, but still painted the Sistine Chapel. He had a harsh childhood growing up in Bonn, Germany, and he was finally able to realize his dream to move to Vienna in 1792. In 1800, his first symphony premiered, and he was the new superstar in Vienna as a composer. He'd been a superstar as a pianist from the time he set foot in the city. But his friends and patrons began to notice he was avoiding social gatherings around this time. No more calls on Haydn. Haydn noticed that. His piano was incredibly out of tune, and it didn't seem to bother him. The decline was gradual but devastating, and it was a secret he tried to hide. In 1802, he was also having other health issues, headaches, etc. So on the advice of his doctor, he went to the village of Heiligenstadt for 6 months to try to recuperate and heal. He contemplated suicide while he was there, but in a letter that we now call the Heiligenstadt Testimony, a letter that he wrote to his brothers that he never sent, but he locked away in a drawer of his desk, and it was discovered after he had died 30 some odd years later. He wrote, "It seemed to be impossible to leave the world until I brought forth all that I thought was in me." He became famous as an eccentric as he went deaf, writing bizarre music, according to some who adored Mozart and Haydn, as did he. He composed best when he was walking, and he was familiar in Vienna and the countryside for wandering, waving his arms, roaring out snatches of melodies. There's a world of difference between his first symphony, 1800, and the second symphony, which premiered in 1803. And he described this work as starting on a new path. The sheer size of this symphony had no precedent. It's more spacious and bolder, has new harmonies, lots of different moods, extraordinary energy. The second movement is a remarkable portrayal of his love of nature and the serenity of the countryside. The first use of the term scherzo to describe a third movement, which would normally have been a minuet or another form. The finale is comic and joyful and sassy with a remarkable coda. It's like a genie released from a bottle. And the coda, which is like the ending of something, is actually about 1/3 of the entire final movement of this symphony. Again, utterly bizarre. And I also did want to mention that as he's processing, he's losing his hearing, he's keeping writing this work, which is a complete opposite of what you think somebody might write when they're exploring such agony in their personal lives. He was also worried about how things would come off in his life as more people found out about his deafness. And he said in the letter, "If my enemies, of whom I have a fair number, were to hear about it, what would they say?" At the premiere of his second symphony, there's a review that I wanted to share just a little bit with you because I found it so fascinating. It is a noteworthy, colossal work of a depth, power, and artistic knowledge like very few. It has a level of difficulty, both from the point of view of the composer and its performance by a large orchestra, which it demands, quite certainly unlike any symphony that has ever been known before. It demands to be played again and again by even the most accomplished orchestra until the astonishing number of original and sometimes very strangely arranged ideas becomes closely enough connected and rounded out and emerges like a great unity, just as the composer had in mind. A modern reader might assume this critic is talking of the monumental Eroica Symphony, the third, or perhaps his fifth or his ninth, almost any one except the second symphony. Yet this reaction was written in 1804 and echoed by other contemporaries who also found the symphony long, difficult, and imposing. Hector Berlioz, who is a composer who will feature on our grand finale concert in April this season, said that this symphony, the second, is smiling throughout. And in a Paris review, though, someone also had a completely different version of it, saying that this music by Beethoven sounds as if doves and crocodiles were locked up together. A Vienna Music Review stated, "This symphony is a hideously wounded, writhing dragon that refuses to die." Well, we beg to differ with that analysis and look forward to presenting this absolutely stunning and cheerful and witty and deep and beautiful symphony to our audience on Saturday night. Stay safe, all. Let's keep going forward and using resilience and resolve to get through COVID and all of the challenges we've been facing as our community at large. And here's to the music, here's to Randy's spirit, and here's to Elizabeth leading us on the podium on yet another wonderful symphonic journey on Saturday nights. Thank you.